Picture a lone figure standing on the peak of a jagged, snowy mountain.
Okay, I have that image.
Above them, there is a golden eagle circling in a sky that is just bruised and purple, incredibly heavy with an impending storm. The air is thick, it feels electric, and suddenly, the silence is shattered by a crack of lightning that illuminates this stark, unforgiving landscape.
It is a very intense vibe.
Right, it is a scene of cinematic intensity, dark, powerful, and fraught with an immense weight. And that exact feeling, that atmospheric pressure of history and an impending, unavoidable storm, is exactly where we begin today. But for our story, we aren't actually on a mountain.
No, we are somewhere very different.
We are in a city square, and it is packed shoulder to shoulder with millions of people. The date is March 4th, 2004. The place is Karbala, Iraq.
And to really understand the gravity of that moment, you have to understand the day itself, because it was the day known as Ashura, the 10th of Muharram in the Islamic calendar.
Which is a massive deal.
Exactly. Millions of Shia pilgrims had gathered in this city, forming this vast sea of people, and they were weeping openly. They were chanting, beating their chests in this profound, rhythmic, ritualized mourning.
And this was significant because of the timeline, right?
Yes, because for the first time in decades, since the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime, they were finally able to mourn openly and proudly in the streets. So the emotion was at an absolute fever pitch. And then the shockwave hit.
Yeah.
It was absolutely deafening.
Reading the accounts from the journalists who were actually there, in those first few seconds, everyone was just rooted to the spot. I mean, the human brain couldn't process the sudden shift from this religious ecstasy to absolute carnage.
It is impossible to process.
And then the screaming began. 9 explosions tore through the dense crowd in the span of just 30 minutes. We are talking car bombs, suicide bombers, mortar fire just raining down. Hundreds of people were killed instantly.
The devastation was unimaginable.
The streets leading up to the incredibly sacred gold-domed mosque were completely destroyed, just covered in blood and debris. The media called it the Ashura massacre. It was a modern tragedy of a scale that is hard to fathom.
It really was. And in the immediate aftermath of that horrific violence, as the smoke finally cleared, a single question just rippled out through the world.
How had it come to this?
Exactly. It was asked by international journalists who were frantically trying to contextualize the violence, by politicians holding emergency briefings, and most heartbreakingly by the survivors themselves who were pulling their loved ones from the rubble. How had it come to this?
But what is truly staggering about that question?
When you zoom out.
Yeah, when you take a step back and look at the grand sweep of time, is that exactly 1,400 years earlier, a shockwave of grief hit the entire Muslim world, originating from this exact same dusty plain in Iraq.
On the exact same day.
Right, and the people back then, reeling from their own unimaginable trauma, asked the exact same question. How had it come to this?
Which brings us to what we are doing here today.
Yes, answering that question is the entire mission of our deep dive today. We are looking directly at you, the listener, and we are inviting you to come with us as we unpack the epic foundational story of the Shia-Sunni split in Islam.
We are going to be drawing extensively from Lesley Hazleton's deeply researched historical narrative, After the Prophet.
It is an incredible source. We are going to take you back through 14 centuries of history to find the origins of that storm we felt on the mountain.
But, and I need to stress this, before we take a single step into that history, it is absolutely crucial that we establish our ground rules for this journey.
Definitely.
The sources we are exploring today touch on deeply held theological beliefs and intensely complex modern political realities. So we want to be crystal clear with you. We are not here to take any political sides.
None at all.
Nor are we endorsing any specific theological positions, be they Sunni or Shia, left-wing or right-wing. Our sole purpose is to impartially report on the content provided in our source material.
We are tracing a historical narrative.
Exactly. This is a profound human story of family feuds, lost necklaces, poisoned blades, and a catastrophic battle on a sandy plain that eternally divided a major world religion.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand 2004, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning. The year is 632 AD. We are in the oasis city of Medina, situated in the vast, arid expanse of the Arabian Peninsula.
The center of this new world.
Right. And Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, the man who managed to unite the famously fractured and warring tribes of the entire peninsula in just 2 decades, is dying. And I think the image people might have in their heads is of a king in a grand marble palace surrounded by doctors.
Which is completely wrong.
It couldn't be further from the truth. He is in a small, one-room reed hut.
Yes, the sheer humility of his surroundings is a vital part of the story. It was the chamber of his youngest and favorite wife, Aisha, and this room was incredibly modest.
How modest are we talking?
We were talking about rough stone walls, a roof made of palm fronds and reeds, and a raised stone bench covered with a leather mattress stuffed with palm fiber for bedding. That was it.
Wow.
And to make matters worse, it was June in Arabia. The desert heat was building to a terrible, stifling intensity. The air inside that small, unventilated room would have been incredibly thick and claustrophobic. Muhammad was 63 years old, and based on the historical descriptions of his physical decline, he was suffering from what modern medical analysis suggests was a severe case of bacterial meningitis.
So what did that actually look like for him physically? Because that sounds awful.
It was agonizing. He was struck by blinding, debilitating headaches. He had wrenching muscle pain and a terrible, overwhelming sensitivity to noise and light.
And the fever.
His fever was so high that his family would pour cold water over him from animal skins just to try and bring his temperature down. But the relief was only ever temporary. He was drifting in and out of consciousness.
And outside this stifling little hut, you have to imagine the scene. The courtyard of the mosque, which was directly attached to these living quarters, was absolutely packed.
Shoulder to shoulder.
People were camped out day and night, holding a desperate vigil. But there was this massive psychological wall they had collectively built up. The idea that the messenger of God, a man who had survived massive military battles, who had evaded multiple highly coordinated assassination attempts, who spoke directly to the divine, could be brought down by a mundane earthly fever.
It was completely incomprehensible to his followers. The psychological denial was absolute. You have to remember, these were hardened desert people. They had seen countless friends and family members die of sickness or in combat, yet they completely refused to believe it could happen to him.
They just couldn't accept it.
The steady murmur of their prayers outside his window eventually turned into a hushed, suffocating panic. Because hovering in that hot desert air, sitting incredibly heavy over the entire oasis, was the one question nobody dared to ask out loud.
If the impossible actually happens, who leads? Who succeeds the prophet?
Precisely.
Because if we're looking at this from a purely political perspective, anytime an emperor, a king, or a supreme leader is on their deathbed, the immediate panic is always about the heir. Who was Muhammad's son? Who was supposed to just take the keys to this newly united Arabian kingdom?
And that is precisely the crisis. He didn't have one.
Wait, really? No sons at all? For a man with multiple wives in a patriarchal society? That seems statistically unusual.
Well, he had sons, but none that survived into adulthood. He had boys with his first wife, Khadija, a woman he loved deeply and was monogamous with for 25 years, but tragically those sons died in infancy.
Oh, that's terrible.
Much later in his life, he had another son by an Egyptian concubine named Maria, but that boy also died when he was just 17 months old. So as Muhammad is lying in this sweltering room, he is dying what the Arabs called abtar.
Abtar, what does that mean?
Intestate, cut off, severed from a male lineage.
Wow. So he has just united this massive, volatile peninsula for the first time in history, and there is no clear line of succession. That is a recipe for absolute political disaster.
What's fascinating here is to pause and consider the what-if of history. What if Muhammad had a surviving adult son? The entire Sunni-Shia split might never have happened.
Because it would have been obvious?
Right, succession would likely have been straightforward and universally accepted by the tribes. Later on, Sunni theologians actually spent a lot of time analyzing this, and they argued that this childlessness was not a tragedy, but divine will.
How do they figure that?
They posited that because Muhammad was the final prophet, the seal of the prophets, bringing the final perfect revelation from God, he logically couldn't have a male heir.
Why not?
Because if he did have a son, people might inevitably claim that the son possessed some sort of inherited prophetic gene or special divine insight by blood. That would completely contradict the core Islamic tenet of the finality of the Quran.
So as to protect the message.
Exactly. Therefore, theologians argue, the lack of a son was the necessary price of revelation. It ensured the message remained the ultimate authority, not a bloodline.
That makes a lot of theological sense in hindsight, but the reality on the ground in Medina in 632 AD was messy.
Very messy.
To understand the community waiting outside that sick room in a panic, you have to understand how they were all connected to each other. It wasn't a neat linear family tree like you might see in European royal houses. 7th century Arabia was more like a tangled forest of vines.
The social structure was entirely tribal and highly interconnected.
Right, because wealthy men could have multiple wives and women frequently married serially due to the high divorce rates, or because they were widowed in the constant tribal skirmishes and battles.
Which happened a lot.
So everyone in Muhammad's inner circle was related to everyone else 3 or 4 different ways. You had half-brothers, cousins who were also brothers-in-law, uncles married to nieces. It was a dense, incredibly complex matrix of kinship and obligation.
And right at the center of this dense matrix, inside that claustrophobic, fever-soaked room, were the 2 people closest to Muhammad, his young wife Aisha and his cousin and son-in-law Ali.
And the tension between these 2 individuals in that small space was palpable. It wasn't just the desert heat making the air unbreathable. It was the glaring, deep-seated animosity between and Ali.
And understand why they absolutely despised each other.
Yeah.
We have to rewind the clock. We have to look at a completely different kind of storm that happened 7 years earlier. A political scandal that threatened to destroy the community, and it all started over a simple, misplaced piece of jewelry.
The affair of the necklace.
Yes, it is known in Islamic history as the affair of the necklace. It sounds like the title of an old Victorian mystery novel, but it was a very real, incredibly damaging political crisis.
Let's set the scene for the listener. It's 7 years before the sickbed. Aisha is a teenager, and she is accompanying Muhammad on a military expedition out into the desert to negotiate with and unite remote tribes.
She loves these trips.
She travels in a howdah, which is basically a canopied cane platform, heavily curtained, strapped to the back of a camel. On the final leg of the journey back to Medina, the army breaks camp in the pre-dawn darkness to avoid the midday sun.
It's still pitch black.
Right. And before getting into her howdah, Aisha steps away from the camp out into the brush to relieve herself. When she comes back, she touches her chest and realizes her wedding necklace is missing.
And it wasn't diamonds or gold. It was a simple string of beads, maybe Yemen agates or seashells, but it was given to her by Muhammad, so it held immense sentimental value.
Now, you have to understand Aisha's personality to understand what happens next. She is notoriously proud, exceptionally intelligent, and fiercely independent. Instead of waking someone up or alerting the caravan masters, she silently slips back into the pitch-black desert to find it herself.
It just goes back out there.
She sifts through the sand and the broom bushes by the faint starlight. Miraculously, she finds the beads, ties them securely in her smock, and walks back to where the camp was. But when she arrives, there is no camp.
None at all.
The dust is settling. The entire expedition, thousands of men and camels, has left without her.
Because her maid had seen her get into the howdah earlier, so when the caravan orders were given to move out, the men leading her camel just assumed she was inside with the curtains drawn. It was light enough to lift, so they didn't notice the weight difference.
So what does a normal person do when they realize their ride just left? You run after them. Camels loaded with gear are not fast, but Aisha, she refuses to run.
She sits down.
She sits down under a thorny acacia tree, wraps her cloak around herself, and essentially decides to wait for them to realize their colossal mistake and come crawling back to fetch her.
It is a moment that perfectly illustrates her immense self-regard. She considered herself exceptional. She was the prophet's favorite wife, his little redhead as he sometimes called her. She was the only wife who was a virgin when they married, unlike his other wives who were widows.
So she had status.
In her mind, it was entirely beneath her dignity to run after a baggage train like a common servant. So she waits. But the sun comes up, the hours tick by, and nobody comes back for her because nobody in the caravan has realized she's missing.
Hours and hours pass in the scorching heat. Finally, a young, handsome Medinan warrior named Safwan, who had been delayed and was riding far behind the main army as a rear guard, spots a figure in the distance.
He rides up, recognizes her instantly, and is horrified.
He averts his eyes, makes his camel kneel, and puts her on it. Then, Safwan leads the camel by the halter on foot all the way back to Medina. Because they are moving so slowly, they arrive in the oasis hours behind everyone else, right in the middle of broad daylight with the entire town out in the streets watching them come in.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to try and understand the mechanics of what was essentially an ancient social media network. The gossip spread through the date orchards, the marketplaces, and the communal wells like wildfire.
Oh, absolutely.
The prophet's teenage wife, left alone in the vast desert for hours with a virile, famously handsome young warrior. The whispering was relentless and vicious. Did they have a tryst out there in the sand? Was the prophet being made a fool of?
It reminds me of a modern viral Twitter scandal. One picture out of context, and suddenly it's a massive controversy that gets completely out of hand. But back then, the scandal wasn't just about the possibility of marital infidelity. The stakes were so much higher. This was pure, unadulterated politics.
Absolutely. A slur on Aisha's reputation was a direct, calculated slur on her father, Abu Bakr. And Abu Bakr was not just anyone. He was one of the most powerful and respected leaders of the emigrants, the original followers who had fled persecution in Mecca alongside Muhammad.
Then there was tension there.
Yes, the native Medinans, known as the helpers who had taken them in, often deeply resented the emigrants' growing political power and wealth. So attacking Aisha's reputation was a highly effective way for rival political factions to attack the ruling establishment. It was a crisis that threatened to tear the fragile, newly formed Islamic community apart at the seams.
Muhammad is completely devastated and doesn't know what to do. The rumors are everywhere. His wife is crying at her parents' house, and the political stability is crumbling. So he calls his inner circle together to consult them. And this is exactly where Ali enters the story.
This is the turning point.
Muhammad asks Ali, his trusted cousin, his adopted son, his son-in-law, who is married to Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, for his advice on the Aisha situation. And Ali looks at the prophet, assesses the political damage, and coldly advises him to just divorce her and be done with the headache.
He famously says, "Women are plentiful. God has not restricted you."
Ali even goes so far as to physically beat Aisha's maid in front of Muhammad to try and force a confession of infidelity out of her.
It was a brutal, incredibly pragmatic piece of advice aimed at cutting off a political infection, and Aisha never, ever forgot it. Ultimately, the crisis is resolved when Muhammad receives a divine revelation that completely clears Aisha's name. This revelation also establishes a strict new legal ruling requiring 4 actual eyewitnesses to the act to prove adultery, making it nearly impossible to prosecute based on hearsay.
So her honor is restored.
Her honor and her father's political standing were definitively saved by divine decree. But the psychological damage between Aisha and Ali was permanent. The rift was set in stone. She would never forgive him for doubting her and suggesting she be discarded.
So with all that history in mind, bring yourself back to that sweltering, claustrophobic sick room in 632 AD. The prophet is dying on the stone bench. Aisha is hovering over him, cooling his brow. Ali is standing right there in the small room.
The air is thick.
It is thick with old hatreds, bitter grudges, and the terrifying new fear of a world without the prophet. And then we get to an event that historians call the dispute of the pen in the pool.
This is undoubtedly one of the most heavily debated and consequential moments in all of Islamic history. It happens on a Thursday, just 4 days before Muhammad finally succumbs to the illness.
He is drifting in and out of a feverish, agonizing semi-consciousness.
The room is packed with his senior companions. Suddenly, in a moment of lucidity, he asks for writing materials. He specifically requests a pen and paper, or more likely, a shoulder blade bone and ink, which was common then, stating he wants to dictate a document, a final will, so that the community will not go astray after he is gone.
You can imagine the sudden silence in the room. This is it, the succession plan. But Omar, who is this towering, fierce, immensely powerful companion of the prophet, a man known for his quick temper and absolute physical dominance, steps forward and stops it.
He physically prevents the writing materials from being brought to the bed.
He addresses the room and says, the prophet is delirious with pain. He doesn't know what he's saying. Omar declares, the book of God is sufficient for us, meaning we have the Quran, we don't need anything else.
An argument immediately erupts in the tiny room. Voices are raised. People are shouting over each other.
The noise and the chaos become absolutely unbearable for the dying Muhammad, and in a final burst of energy, he orders everyone to get out. He kicks his closest friends and advisors out of his death chamber.
This raises an important question, perhaps the central question of our entire deep dive today. What was he going to write?
Right.
The Shia firmly, unequivocally believe he was going to officially, formally name Ali as his political and spiritual successor. They believe Omar, who was allied with Abu Bakr, knew this perfectly well and deliberately thwarted the prophet's explicit will to secure power for his own faction.
And the Sunnis.
Sunnis, on the other hand, look at the exact same event and believe Omar was acting out of deep compassion. They argue Omar was protecting a dying beloved friend from the immense stress of dictating a complex legal document in his final hours and demonstrating a profound theological faith that the Quran and the collective consensus of the community would be enough to guide them.
The ambiguity of that unwritten document is the ultimate tragedy. We will never truly know what he intended to say.
Never.
And the reason the Shia are so incredibly confident that he was going to write Ali's name brings us to the second half of that phrase, the pool. Just 3 months earlier, Muhammad was leading a massive pilgrim caravan back from Mecca to Medina. He ordered the caravan to halt at an oasis called Ghadir Qum, the Pool of Qum.
It wasn't a planned stop, which made it significant.
He called for a makeshift pulpit to be built out of piled-up camel saddles so he could be seen by the thousands of travelers. He called Ali up to stand beside him on the saddle.
So he took Ali's hand, raised it high in the air so everyone in the vast crowd could see, and declared, "He of whom I am master, of him Ali is also the master."
Now, hearing that in English, it sounds pretty definitive, right? He is the master. But here is where it gets really interesting. This entire 1,400-year-old schism, the wars, the empires, the theological debates, so much of it comes down to the translation and interpretation of a single Arabic word in that sentence.
The word is mawla, and Arabic is a language incredibly rich with nuance, where multiple, sometimes contradictory meanings can stem from a single three-letter root.
So what does mawla mean?
Mawla can mean master, lord, or supreme political leader. If it means that, then Muhammad was clearly publicly designating Ali as his political and spiritual successor. But mawla can also mean a beloved friend, a trusted patron, or a loyal client.
That is a huge difference.
If it means that, then Muhammad, aware of the growing political jealousy toward Ali among the older companions, was simply asking the community to love, respect, and support his cousin.
It's mind-blowing that a single word's definition can carry the weight of millions of lives.
It is the tectonic fault line of Islam. The Sunni interpretation leans heavily toward the latter, a public declaration of deep spiritual kinship and a call for familial respect. The Shia interpretation is that it was an explicit, undeniable political appointment, an anointing of the heir apparent.
And this profound ambiguity, this constant tug of war over who is closest to the prophet, follows Muhammad right up to his very last breath. When he finally passes away in that sweltering hut on Monday, June 8th, 632 AD, even the physical reality of his death is fiercely contested territory.
Yes.
Ali and his supporters claim that he was holding Muhammad, that the prophet's head was resting in his lap, and that he died in Ali's arms. Aisha fiercely maintains that Muhammad died with his head resting right against her chest, between her collarbone and her heart.
Even the final exhalation of his life is claimed as political capital by the two bitterest rivals in the room. It's almost poetic in a really dark way.
It really is. And once that final breath is taken, the harsh reality sets in outside that hut. With Muhammad gone, the community was suddenly violently unmoored. The wailing that erupted from the women inside the hut spread through the oasis at the speed of sound.
People were literally pouring dust on their own heads, tearing their clothes, beating their chest in visceral, devastating grief. They were, as one companion later put it, like sheep on a rainy night, completely lost, panicked, and without their shepherd.
I can only imagine the panic. You mentioned earlier they didn't even believe he could die. What happens when the impossible actually happens? We've talked about the emotional fallout, but politically, the clock starts ticking instantly.
Immediately.
While Ali and his close kinsmen retreat into the hut to wash Muhammad's body and prepare him for the grave, which is a solemn, vital, and time-consuming familial duty, the politics of survival kick into high gear out in the city.
While Ali is distracted with the funeral rites, a secret council, a shura, is hastily convened by the political heavyweights.
It was a chaotic, incredibly tense meeting, driven by the absolute necessity of preventing the community from fracturing before the sun went down.
The native Medinans, the helpers, were already meeting in a shaded portico, considering choosing their own leader and breaking the alliance. When the Meccan immigrants, led by Omar and Abu Bakr, heard about this, they crashed the meeting.
They just barged right in.
They knew they had to act decisively to keep the fragile new empire intact. Through sheer force of personality, intimidation, and brilliant political maneuvering, Omar manages to shut down the Medinans and pushes through the nomination of Abu Bakr, Aisha's father.
Abu Bakr accepts the oath of allegiance. He becomes the first caliph, which simply means successor.
Right.
And what about Ali? He's the cousin, the son-in-law, the guy from the Pool of Qum.
Ali is completely sidelined. He isn't even at the meeting. By the time he finishes preparing the prophet's body for burial, the political decision has been made. He steps out of the hut and is presented with a fait accompli. The empire has moved on without him.
And this begins what Ali would later bitterly refer to as his years of dust and thorns. He is given the nickname Abu Turab, meaning father of dust, originally a term of endearment for Muhammad, but it takes on a melancholic tone. Ali endures 25 years of being passed over for the leadership. Not once, but 3 separate times. He watches other men rule the empire he helped build.
Yes, Abu Bakr rules for just 2 years before dying of illness. On his deathbed, he appoints Omar as the second caliph. And under Omar, the Islamic map of the world changes forever.
How so?
Under Omar, the Islamic Empire explodes outward in a wave of military conquest that rivals Alexander the Great. In just 10 years, these hardened desert warriors conquer the Levant, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. They completely shatter the ancient, massive Persian Empire and permanently cripple the Byzantine Empire.
That's wild. You usually hear about this period framed strictly as a religious crusade, like they were conquering purely to convert people to Islam by the sword.
Right, that's the popular simplified myth. But when historians dig into the sources and the economics of the time, the reality is much more pragmatic. It wasn't primarily about converting souls. Forced conversion was actually quite rare initially.
So what was it about?
It was about economics. It was driven by a need for agricultural resources, arable land, and taxation. The Arabian Peninsula is incredibly resource poor. Suddenly, these tribes have access to the unimaginable wealth of the Fertile Crescent.
Ah, so it was less of a holy war and more of an imperial gold rush.
Exactly. It was incredibly lucrative. The spoils of war were pouring back into Medina. But here's the profound insight. The takeaway that echoes through history: rapid, unprecedented wealth almost always brings corruption.
That's a classic historical pattern.
The original followers of Muhammad were ascetics. They were used to poverty, simplicity, and egalitarianism. Suddenly, they are sitting on literal mountains of Persian gold and Byzantine silver. And that wealth starts to rot the social fabric of Medina from the inside out.
And the violence of the frontier eventually follows the gold back to the capital. Omar, this towering, terrifying warrior who conquered empires, is assassinated right in the mosque in Medina. He is stabbed by a Persian slave with a poisoned dagger.
Then Othman, a wealthy aristocratic merchant from the Umayyad clan who becomes the third caliph, faces even worse.
The wealth inequality under his rule becomes so extreme that mutinous Egyptian soldiers march on Medina. Othman is literally besieged in his own home and hacked to death while reading the Quran. The empire is completely tearing itself apart.
And it is only then, with the community in absolute terrifying chaos, the capital blood-stained, and the vast new empire teetering on the brink of total collapse, the panicked elders turn to Ali.
Finally.
After 25 years of waiting in the wings, studying, teaching, and watching the moral decay, the caliphate finally falls to him. But it is a poisoned chalice. He is handed a fractured, deeply divided empire that is effectively ungovernable. And to make matters worse, his oldest, most bitter rival is waiting for him.
Aisha, the favorite wife. She has spent the last 25 years consolidating her influence as the mother of the faithful, and she blames Ali for the chaos. Specifically, she loudly and publicly accuses him of shielding the mutineers who murdered Othman.
She demands immediate, bloody justice.
And when Ali hesitates, trying to prioritize maintaining order and preventing a wider massacre, she decides to take matters into her own hands. We are about to enter the period known as fitna.
Fitna is a terrifying, loaded concept in the Arabic psyche. The root of the word originally refers to the smelting of gold, the intense fire that burns away impurities. By extension, it means being led astray, temptation, or a severe trial.
But practically.
But its practical historical meaning is civil war. It is the ultimate nightmare scenario for a religious community. It means the breakdown of all social order. It means tribes splitting apart, cousins fighting cousins, the community of believers turning their sanctified swords against each other. It was exactly what Muhammad had dedicated his entire life to preventing.
Aisha uses her immense wealth and influence to raise a massive army in Mecca, and she marches toward the garrison city of Basra in Iraq to challenge Ali's authority. And on this march, a profoundly spooky, almost supernatural thing happens.
The dogs of Hawab.
Yes, the army stops for the night at a dark, isolated desert oasis. The camp is quiet. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by the sound of wild desert dogs howling from the darkness, a really eerie, bone-chilling sound.
Aisha is startled and asks her local guides what this place is called. They tell her it is the waters of Hawab. And upon hearing that name, Aisha absolutely panics.
She realizes she made a mistake.
The sources say she screams the prayer for the dead aloud. She realizes with absolute terror that she is fulfilling a dark prophecy. Years earlier, Muhammad had once looked at his wives and warned them, saying, "I wish I knew which one of you the dogs of Hawab would howl at."
It was an omen of deep disaster and misguidance.
She begs her commanders to turn the army around and take her back to Medina, terrified of the cosmic implications of what she has set in motion. But her generals, who have their own political ambitions, flatter her, downplay the omen, and convince her to push forward.
And that fateful decision leads us to the Battle of the Camel. Imagine the scene. It's a massive, bloody, chaotic clash in the Iraqi desert outside Basra. Tens of thousands of Muslims fighting each other for the first time, and right in the dead center of it all is Aisha.
She is sitting inside a towering howdah on top of a massive, specially bred red riding camel. But the howdah isn't covered in a normal suncloth. It is draped in heavy, impenetrable chainmail armor and bright red silk.
She is the ultimate, highly visible rallying point for her army. She isn't watching the battle from a safe hill in the rear. She is right in the thick of the carnage. Her piercing voice cuts through the clash of swords and the screams of horses, urging her warriors on, calling for the blood of Othman's killers.
Her men view her as the literal mother of the faithful. They believe fighting for her is fighting for the Prophet's legacy, and they will do anything to protect her.
And the fighting around that red camel is horrific. It becomes a meat grinder. Men are literally throwing themselves in front of the beast to protect it. As Ali's men try to rush the camel and grab its reins to stop it from moving, their hands and arms are sliced off by Aisha's elite defenders.
The historical accounts describe the severed hands literally piling up in the bloody sand around the camel's hooves. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of men die, just trying to hold the bridle.
Finally, Ali is watching the slaughter, realizes the only way to stop the madness is to drop the focal point. He orders his bravest warriors to slip under the defenses and cut the camel's hamstrings.
The massive beast groans and collapses, the armored howdah crashes hard to the ground, and the psychological will of Aisha's army breaks. The battle ends. Aisha is defeated.
The gender dynamics of this moment are endlessly fascinating to analyze. Aisha was heavily, bitterly criticized by later conservative male historians for leaving her domestic sphere, for stepping out of the home to lead an army of men into civil war.
They argued she caused needless death and chaos by stepping out of her place. But, and this is crucial to understand how history works, had she won that battle, she almost certainly would have been immortalized as a supreme heroine, a brilliant tactician, a veritable Joan of Arc of the Middle East who saved the empire from corruption.
History is written by the victors.
Exactly. History is incredibly malleable that way. The victor dictates the moral framework. Ali, to his immense credit and reflecting his piety, treats her with profound respect after her capture. He doesn't execute her or humiliate her.
He provides her with an armed escort of women disguised as men and sends her safely back to Medina to live out her days. But the ideological damage to the community, the fitna, is done. The seal is broken. The taboo is shattered. Muslims have slaughtered Muslims.
And Ali has absolutely no time to rest or rebuild, because while he successfully put down Aisha's rebellion in Iraq, a much, much bigger threat is waiting for him in Syria, a man named Muawiyah.
Who exactly is this guy?
Muawiyah is the incredibly wealthy, cunning, and highly competent governor of Syria. He is a member of the Umayyad clan, the same aristocratic family as the murdered Caliph Othman. Muawiyah has spent years building a fiercely loyal, well-paid, and highly disciplined army in Damascus.
And he challenges Ali.
When Ali becomes caliph, Muawiyah flat-out refuses to swear allegiance to him, using Othman's unavenged death as his political pretext. He wants the empire for himself.
So Ali marches his battle-weary army north, and they meet Muawiyah's fresh Syrian forces at a desolate place called Siffin, right near the banks of the Euphrates River.
And Siffin wasn't a quick, decisive skirmish. It was a grinding, agonizing, incredibly bloody standoff that lasted for weeks. It was a war of attrition.
The commanders would literally ride into each other's camps at night to negotiate, share tea, and try to find a diplomatic way out, and then fight each other to the death by day. It eventually culminated in a brutal, unrestrained 3-day engagement.
The fighting was so intense it went straight through the darkness. They historically called it the Night of Shrieking, because the pitch-black darkness was filled with the unearthly, terrifying howls of men dying slowly in the mud and the clash of invisible steel.
Arrows were falling so thick that Ali's own sons, Hassan and Hussein, were frantically trying to physically shield their father with their bodies. But despite the horror, Ali is winning. His veteran Iraqi forces are pushing Muawiyah's Syrian army back toward the river.
He is on the verge of crushing the rebellion once and for all and reuniting the empire. And then here's where it gets really interesting.
Muawiyah gets desperate.
Muawiyah is desperate. He's a brilliant strategist, and he knows he is losing the martial battle. So, advised by his cunning lieutenant, he employs a brilliant completely cynical psychological tactic. He orders his frontline soldiers to take pages of the Quran, the sacred holy book of Islam, the literal word of God, and spear them on the razor-sharp tips of their lances.
They hoist the holy words high in the air above the blood-soaked battlefield and march toward Ali's advancing lines, shouting, "Let the book of God decide between us!" They are demanding an immediate ceasefire and arbitration based on religious law.
Ali is a seasoned warrior and a brilliant man. He sees right through it instantly. He knows it's a cheap trick, a cynical ploy to buy time and avoid a total rout. He yells at his men to ignore the pages, to keep fighting, to crush the rebellion now, or face decades of war.
But his own warriors, specifically a large, powerful faction of ultra-pious, deeply religious soldiers known as the Quran readers, freeze. They drop their swords. They absolutely refuse to swing a weapon at the physical word of God.
They turn on Ali, their own commander, and threaten to kill him right there on the battlefield if he doesn't accept the ceasefire and the arbitration.
It is a mutiny based on literalist piety. They force Ali to halt the battle and agree to negotiate. But the negotiations drag on for months, and eventually the arbiters rule against Ali, essentially stripping him of his legitimacy as caliph and placing him on equal footing with Muawiyah, the rebel.
And here is the staggering psychological twist. Those exact same pious warriors who violently forced Ali to stop fighting and accept the arbitration turn around and blame him for the outcome.
They blame him.
They claim that by accepting human arbitration instead of letting God decide the victor on the battlefield, Ali committed a grave, unforgivable sin against God. They break away from his army entirely. They become known as the Kharijites, which translates to the rejectionists or those who go out.
And these Kharijites, they are terrifying. If we are tracking the evolution of the region, they are the birth of violent, uncompromising religious extremism in this story.
Absolutely. The Kharijites adopted a horrific binary purity test. They believed that anyone who compromised, anyone who engaged in politics, anyone who didn't follow their incredibly strict, literal interpretation of the faith down to the smallest detail was not just wrong, but an apostate, a non-believer.
And in their warped theology, the punishment for apostasy was immediate death.
To really drive home how warped and terrifying their logic became, let me give you an example from the historical sources.
Please do.
A group of these heavily armed Kharijites are walking through a date orchard. One of them casually picks up and eats a single date that had fallen from a tree onto the path. The others immediately surround him, draw their swords, and threaten him, demanding he find the owner of the tree and pay for the stolen date, because theft, no matter how small, is a sin that warrants death.
Over a single date.
A few minutes later, on the same road, one of them accidentally startles and kills a farmer's cow. Again, they obsessively wait around to find the farmer and pay him for the animal. But when the farmer arrives and they start questioning him, and he realizes who they are and bravely disagrees with their extreme political theology, what do?
They butcher him.
Exactly. They hack him to death. They disembowel his pregnant wife. They murder an entire innocent family in cold blood over a nuanced political disagreement, but they make absolutely sure they paid for the cow and the fallen date.
It is the terrifying psychological profile of the extremists throughout history. An obsessive, performative adherence to the letter of the law regarding minor infractions, coupled with an absolute remorseless barbarity toward human life if it deviates even slightly from their ideological purity. There are no innocents in their worldview. You are either perfectly aligned with them or you are marked for death.
And it is a Kharijite assassin who finally brings down Ali. It's the year 661 AD. Ali is in his new capital city of Kufa in Iraq. It's the sacred month of Ramadan. He is walking into the mosque in the dark, early hours of the morning to lead the prayers.
The assassin, a Kharijite who had been waiting in the shadows, strikes him on the head with a sword. And it's not just any sword. It's a blade that was soaked for over a month in a horrific concoction of poisons.
Yes, the historical sources describe these alchemical poisons in terrifying detail. The assassin used cyanide extracted from crushed apricot pits, deadly nightshade, monk's hood. The blade was carefully designed so that even the slightest nick, a superficial scratch, would be fatal.
The strike hits Ali squarely on the head. He survives the initial blow, but the poison rapidly enters his bloodstream. The great warrior, the cousin of the prophet, the father of dust, dies in absolute agony 2 days later.
Which brings us to the apex of the mountain. We are back on that jagged, snowy peak we described at the beginning. The storm is fully upon us now. The lightning is striking the ground. The thunder is deafening. We are moving to the absolute emotional and spiritual core of our deep dive, the tragedy of Karbala.
With Ali dead, Muawiyah easily takes over the entire empire and rules comfortably from Damascus, establishing the Umayyad dynasty. When Muawiyah dies after a long reign, he breaks precedent and passes the caliphate down to his son, Yazid.
Yazid is a man widely considered by both Sunni and Shia sources to be corrupt, cynical, a drunkard, and a tyrant who cared nothing for the religion. And Ali's second son, Hussein, who is now a deeply revered religious scholar in his 50s living in Medina, absolutely refuses to swear allegiance to Yazid.
Hussein receives bags of letters from the people of Kufa, his father's old capital in Iraq, begging him to come lead them in a righteous rebellion against Yazid's tyranny.
It's the year 680 AD Hussein rides out toward Iraq. But this isn't a massive, conquering army marching to war. It's a tiny, vulnerable caravan. He brings his wives, his sisters, his infant children, and only 72 loyal warriors.
It's a tragic, impossibly small force heading straight into the teeth of the massive Umayyad military machine.
And Yazid's ruthless governor in Iraq doesn't take any chances with the Prophet's grandson. He intercepts the litters, crushes the incipient rebellion in Kufa, and sends a massive, heavily armed military force, thousands of cavalry and archers, to intercept Hussein's small caravan in the desert.
They corner Hussein on a desolate, sun-baked plain near the Euphrates River, a place called Karbala. The name itself is said to be a portmanteau of ancient Arabic and Aramaic words meaning destruction, grief, and tribulation. The Umayyad army completely encircles Hussein's camp and cuts them off from the river. Under the blazing desert sun, the women and children in Hussein's camp begin to suffer agonizing, debilitating thirst.
The night before the final battle is one of the most poignant, heartbreaking moments in all of history. Hussein gathers his 72 men in a tent. He knows the Kufans are not coming. He tells his men that the cause is lost. He tells them the Umayyad army only wants his head, and he officially, legally releases his men from their binding oaths of loyalty.
He tells them to use the cover of the pitch-black night to slip away into the desert and save their own lives.
But not a single man leaves. They flatly refuse. They choose to stay and die with the Prophet's grandson. They spend the entire night in fervent prayer. They melt myrrh in bowls and anoint their bodies, preparing themselves for the grave. Hussein takes off his heavy armor and puts on a simple, seamless white robe, a burial shroud. They're not preparing for victory. They are actively embracing shahadat.
Let's pause there. What does that concept mean exactly in this context?
Shahadat is often simply translated into English as martyrdom, but that loses so much of the nuance. Its deeper, truer meaning is witnessing. By actively sacrificing themselves when they had the option to run, they are acting as ultimate witnesses to the corruption, the illegitimacy, and the tyranny of Yazid's regime.
It is an act of ultimate spiritual defiance. They are choosing death over submission to an unjust ruler, making a moral statement that will outlast the empire.
And the next day, the 10th of Muharram, the day of Ashura, is an absolute, unmitigated massacre. The stories of that day are etched permanently into the soul of Shia Islam. It's a series of heartbreaking vignettes of impossible bravery and utter despair. There is Qasim, Hussein's young nephew, barely a teenager who was just married in the camp the night before. He rides out to fight, the pearls of his wedding turban swinging in the desert wind, and is brutally hacked to pieces by grown men before his new bride's eyes.
There is Abbas, Hussein's incredibly brave, fiercely loyal half-brother. Driven mad by the crying of the thirsty children in the tents, he takes a leather water skin and charges, breaking through the enemy lines all the way to the Euphrates River. He fills the skin, but on his way back he is ambushed by archers and spearmen. He fights fiercely until his right arm is severed. He switches his sword to his left hand, fighting on, refusing to drop the water.
When his left arm is cut off, he carries the heavy water skin in his teeth, crawling, desperate to reach the children. But a mace strikes him down, an arrow pierces the water skin, and the life-saving water flows out into the hot sand, turning red with his blood.
Then there is Ali Akbar, Hussein's eldest son, an impossibly handsome young man who is said to look exactly like the Prophet Muhammad. He rides out into single combat and is quickly surrounded and overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. As he falls, pierced by spears, the historical sources say Hussein swooped in like a hawk, desperate to save him, but he is too late, and he has to cradle his son's broken, bleeding body in the dust. It's a scene of unimaginable, paralyzing parental grief.
By midday, under the relentless sun, every single one of the 72 warriors is dead. Hussein is entirely alone. He is exhausted, parched, and bleeding. He mounts his beautiful white stallion, Lahik. He rides out to face the army of thousands by himself. He is showered with a volley of arrows. He fights until he is physically unable to lift his sword, bleeding from over 70 distinct wounds. and finally he is surrounded, struck down into the dirt, and beheaded. The Umayyad soldiers loot the camp. The women and children, including Hussein's sister Zainab, are put in heavy iron chains. The head of the Prophet's grandson is put on the tip of a spear and paraded through the desert all the way to Damascus. It is the absolute darkest moment, a complete, crushing, total defeat.
It was military annihilation. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this catastrophic military defeat slowly, over centuries, transformed into an unparalleled spiritual and political victory. The memory of Karbala, the profound injustice of it, became the defining, beating core of Shia identity. And that brings us to the eternal echo of this story. How does a small, asymmetrical battle lost in the Iraqi desert in the year 680 fundamentally shape the world today? It's through the immense power of memory. Every year, during the 10 days of Muharram leading up to Ashura, the Shia community actively relives this trauma. They don't just remember it, they reenact it.
They stage tatziyah, which are these elaborate, highly emotional passion plays where the events of Karbala are acted out in the streets. People weep openly, tears streaming down their faces. Men march in massive processions, beating their chests in unison, sometimes flagellating themselves with chains until they bleed, physically sharing in the pain of Hussein's sacrifice.
It is a profound communal way of keeping the wound fresh. It is a way of insisting that the fight against tyranny is never over, that the blood of Karbala is still wet, and in the 20th century, this ancient mourning memory was weaponized in a completely modern revolutionary way. A Sorbonne-educated Iranian sociologist named Ali Shariati brilliantly reframed the ancient story of Karbala for a modern audience.
For our listeners who might not know, Shariati was a brilliant intellectual in the 1960s and 70s. Before Shariati, Hussein was primarily viewed by the traditional clergy as a tragic victim, an intercessor whose suffering should be deeply mourned to gain spiritual merit. Shariati, blending Western revolutionary philosophy, think Karl Marx and Franz Fanon, with deeply rooted Islamic theology, completely transformed Hussein into an active, radical political revolutionary.
He argued that Hussein didn't just passively go to his death, he actively, consciously chose martyrdom to expose the oppression of the corrupt state. Shariati told the Iranian people, who were living under the highly repressive secret police state of the Western-backed Shah, that to merely cry and mourn for Hussein was insulting to his memory. They had to act like Hussein. They had to rise up against their own modern Yazid.
Every day is Ashura, and every place is Karbala. That became the massive rallying cry. Shariati's underground lectures drew thousands of young students. He laid the vital intellectual groundwork that the Ayatollah Khomeini later capitalized on to ignite the 1979 Iranian Revolution. They literally used a 7th century narrative of martyrdom to overthrow a heavily armed 20th century monarchy. The blood-stained banners of Karbala were raised over the barricades in the streets of modern Tehran.
And the theology goes even deeper than just revolution, touching on apocalyptic visions that actively drive modern geopolitics. The concept of the Mahdi, what is that?
Yes, the 12 or Shia, the majority branch in Iran and Iraq, believe that the 12th Imam, a direct descendant of Ali and Hussein, did not die in the 9th century, but was taken by God into occultation, a hidden mystical state. They believe he is the Mahdi, a messianic savior figure who will return at the end of days, alongside Jesus, to defeat tyranny, exact vengeance for Karbala, and establish absolute global justice.
And this isn't just an abstract, dusty theological concept discussed in seminaries. When Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad took office in 2005, he explicitly stated in speeches that his government's primary policy would be guided by the principle of hastening the return of the Mahdi. In Iraq, the powerful Shia cleric and militia leader Muqtada al-Sadr named his heavily armed forces the Mahdi Army. The ancient prophecy is an active, heavily armed geopolitical force today.
Which brings us full circle, back to the tragic violence we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive. Sunni extremist groups like al-Qaeda in Iraq and later ISIS intimately understand the immense power of these Shia symbols. That is precisely why they specifically targeted the Ashura pilgrims in Karbala in 2004 with those coordinated suicide bombings.
It is why, in 2006, they bypassed military targets, infiltrated the city of Samarra, planted high explosives, and completely destroyed the golden dome of the Asgharia shrine, the exact holy site where the Mahdi is believed to have entered occultation. They weren't just blowing up a beautiful building, they were trying to detonate the very core of Shia identity. Their explicit goal was to intentionally trigger a sectarian civil war, to reignite the fitna.
So, what does this all mean? We started this deep dive in a claustrophobic, fever-soaked sick room in Medina, looking at a dying prophet and the political fallout of a feud over a lost seashell necklace. We traveled across burning deserts, witnessed the terrifying howling dogs of Hawab, The cynical political maneuvers in Syria, the poisoned alchemical blaze in Kufa, and the absolute heart-wrenching heartbreak of Karbala.
And we end up looking at devastating car bombs in the 21st century and the nuclear ambitions of modern nation-states. The dots connect flawlessly across 1,400 years of history.
If we synthesize all of this, if we look at the immense span of time we've just covered, the most profound takeaway is the staggering power of belief over raw historical fact. Did Muhammad really intend to write Ali's name on that document on that chaotic Thursday? Did the word Mala spoken at the saddle pulpit by the pool mean absolute leader or just beloved friend? Did Hussein's white horse really weep literal tears of blood at Karbala? In the grand sweeping arc of human history, the exact empirical truth of those specific moments matters far less than what millions of people believe happened. The deep meaning assigned to the story is what actually forged the reality of the modern Middle East. The story has escaped the dry bonds of history and become meta-history. It is a living, breathing entity.
It is a phenomenal journey, and we've covered incredible ground today. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as we end this deep dive. We have all heard the old, tired cliche that history is written by the victors. The kings, the conquerors, the sprawling empires, they build the towering monuments, they mint the coins, and they write the textbooks. But the epic, enduring story of the Shia-Sunni split proves a dynamic that is infinitely more powerful and far more dangerous. Memory is forged by the defeated. When a people lose a massive battle, when they are slaughtered and marginalized on a desert plain, they do not just forget it and assimilate. They internalize the trauma. They sacralize it. They write agonizing poems. They stage emotional plays. And they pass the burning grief down from parent to child, generation to generation, until that memory crystallizes into a weapon sharper than any steel sword. The victors may write the history of the day, but the defeated can forge a memory capable of toppling those same empires 1,000 years later. Look at the world around you right now. What seemingly small grievances, what overlooked defeats, what intense historical memories are we forging today that might explode and reshape the world 1,000 years from now?